Now 6 o'clock, I'd like to call the meeting order. Faye, would you please call the roll?
Director Alamo,
Yes.
Director Alvarez, Director Buck. Yes. Director Escia,
Here.
Director Espinoza,
Here.
Director Esquire,
Here.
Director Klein,
Here.
Director Lindo, Director Maldonado,
Thank you. Next up, agenda item number C, approval of the minutes.
Motion to approve.
Second to that?
Second.
motion? Properly moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion on the minutes? All in favor, say aye, please.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Next on the agenda, public comment period. Interested persons in the audience are welcome to introduce any topic within the agency's jurisdiction. No action may be undertaken on any item not appearing on the posted agenda, except that the board may briefly respond to the comments, refer to the matter to their staff, or request it to be placed on a future agenda. Is there any public comment? Seeing none, we'll proceed with staff updates. Joint TAC update, Lacey.
Good evening, Lacey McBride, Merced County. I have 3 items for you for the joint TAC. And the first is the Prop 68 grant award. So if you'll recall, the Turlock Subbasin submitted a grant application under the Proposition 68 Sustainable Groundwater Management Program Round 3 grant late last year. It was a $1 million application that included 3 projects for the entire basin: a draft programmatic environmental impact report, monitoring wells, and the GRAT tool, the groundwater recharge assessment tool. Good news, in late January, the Department of Water Resources did release a draft award list, which included the Turlock Subbasin as included as a full award, so the full $1 million. There were some minor changes that we do have to make to our proposal, but those changes don't affect the award amount or the projects that we've included. So currently that draft award is open for public comment, and it will be final in March. And so we're anticipating a final award in March. We're working with our treasurer at TID to ensure that the basin-wide account for GSP development has the cash flow available for these projects to be able to start on these projects and then submit the reimbursement the cost to DWR for reimbursement. And so we'll make sure that we're able to have that cash on hand. And we're also working with DWR on the amendment to our current grant contract. This round 3 grant is it's not going to be a new contract with the GSAs. It's going to be an amendment to the current Proposition 1 grant that we have. And so if it looks like that the contracting is going to be a lengthy effort, we might consider looking into our options for starting work on these projects early, which is similar to what we did with the Proposition 1 grant, that the contracting was taking a long time and we just went ahead and started early, which means the GSAs do have to wait a little bit longer for those reimbursements to come in. The second and third item I have are a couple of things that the joint TACs have been discussing at their last meetings. In January, we started a conversation about GSA administration and GSP development revenue options. And so this is initial discussions on revenue. As you know, the GSA is currently funded by member contributions. And we know that as soon as the GSP is completed, we'll be facing new GSP implementation costs, starting with the first annual report, which will be due 2 months after we finish developing the GSP. And we also know that implementation, like starting the monitoring program, will also start right away. And so those costs will come in right away. At the TAC level, we started talking about, is there an interest from the member agencies in continuing for this to be member funded, or to transition this to a different type of funding, like landowner fee-funded program where the landowners who are benefiting from having the GSP in place are funding this. And so we started that discussion with a review of options by our GSA council and a discussion of what other GSAs, mostly GSAs who are on the 2020 timeline, who completed their GSP in January of 2020, what they've done regarding funding GSA administration and GSP implementation. So that was an initial discussion. The TAC's going to return to this topic in March in an attempt to identify a path forward and a recommendation that we can make back to this board. So the third item I have for you is a GSP chapter review process. So the TAC's been discussing how the GSP chapters are going to be reviewed by both the TAC, the GSA board, and the public. And so the TAC wanted to be able to give the public the opportunity to review these chapters as they are released and comment on the chapters. This also helps us comply with SGMA's requirement for stakeholder engagement, and it would give the public the opportunity to see these chapters in smaller chunks rather than releasing a single GSP at the end of this process and having like a 30 or 60-day comment period for a very long, hundreds of pages document. And that could open the GSA up to some criticism. That's one of the things we've learned from the GSPs in the 2020 process. So the tentative process for GSP chapter review that we're discussing is that each draft chapter will have a preliminary draft. This is the draft that will go to the technical committee. It's will be reviewed only by the technical committee, and then the TAC members will have the opportunity to make comments. Once we get a version of that chapter that the TAC is happy with, we then release an administrative draft to the GSA board and to the public for comment. And of course, the board will be kept apprised of the GSP progress through reports at this board meeting. But there would be an administrative draft that would then go out for public review. Public would have a length of time to comment on it, and then we'd have a final chapter draft kind of buttoned up before our entire GSP is completed. So that's the process that we talked about. It's still kind of a draft process. They haven't completely made a final decision on that, but that's the direction we're going in right now. And then finally in December, we did have a technical workshop that Todd Groundwater presented at, and I think you're going to get more information on that later on in the agenda, so I'm going to leave that for Phyllis to talk to you guys about. So I'm happy to answer any questions on those items.
TAC want more feedback from us as far as the funding source now, or wait until you get your recommendation to us? Should we go back to our councils and our boards to see how they're feeling on this issue?
So one of the things that we had talked about in January was we did give all of the agencies who attend the TAC, which I believe everybody here on the board either attends the TAC or has other staff who attend the TAC. And part of these 2 months between January and March was to give the agencies the chance to go back to their board, their home agencies, and get a little bit more direction on what the interest is there, if they want to continue member funding, if they want to come up with some sort of fee through this TAC process. And so part of it was on that level. If as board members, if you want to get some direction from your agencies and report that back to the TAC, so then the TAC knows about that going into this March discussion, I think that would be helpful too.
Thank you.
Lacey, could you give me, because you've talked to the people that are on the 2020 track, what are they doing about funding? What's typical, or there's different methods, right? But
there are different methods. I would say around us, and I probably up north, and for them I would look at council who's worked with them. We've seen the Proposition 218 used, and so that's
an acre assessment, or how's it set up? Is that
See that as an acre assessment,
Parcel
as
based.
as a water service fee.
That's right. So far, there's not sufficient data to do a groundwater extraction fee. For that, you would have to have very good groundwater extraction data. You'd have to have all meters, all wells metered, and have to have a very good understanding of, everyone who's extracting in the basin and how much they extract and have that calibrated in order to satisfy your Prop 26 and 218 fees. And just frankly, not that many people have that much data. So people have gone to what they're calling a regulatory fee, and because it's property related, because it's Sigma is covering your acre, then it is subject to 218. People have been doing a per acre 218 fee. So far, three basins have done that specifically to fund Sigma activities.
Have community service districts done the same thing? How do they handle it with
How the cities handle that? They
The city
cover their
or-
acres in their cities? How would that work?
So what usually happens in the 218 is that the GSA does it, and it's for the whole, so it's the basin
Yeah.
boundary. And then sometimes down in McMullen, they pulled out city parcels that were less than an acre and frankly just exempted them. And other people have just paid, the cities pay for that. Let's say a city is 100 acres. You're not gonna charge every single, the cost for the administration exceeds the cost that you're gonna get back. So sometimes people have carved out the cities. The city has paid, kind of like on a member basis fee for their acreage, the same price that all the other landowners are paying. And then they get that back to the general fund. So, the whole point of a 218 is it has to be,
Yeah.
tied to a reasonable cost for the service. So you can't charge one parcel more than another unless they're getting more service.
Okay.
Questions for Lacey on that? You got interbasin coordination right behind that?
I've got one more real quick for you. So we haven't had any interbasin meetings between the Turlock Basin and our neighboring basins, but I just following up on that 2020 timeline. So we have two neighboring basins, south to Merced and west the Delta Mendota, that were on that 2020 timeline. They did submit their GSPs, a single GSP in Merced and 6 coordinated GSPs in the Delta Mendota, all submitted on time, accepted by DWR and posted online for a 75-day public comment period. And so right now, that's where those 2020, our neighboring basins are, is they're in a public comment period, public comment for DWR, that'll end on April 15th. And then they'll be evaluated by DWR for approval. They have 2 years for that.
Are we commenting on the adjoining basins or TAC? Is there anything, are you guys looking over their plans?
We've submitted comments on Turlock and the Delta Mendota, basically not necessarily on their plans, but we've submitted comments that we are looking forward to continuing coordination with them to make sure that their plans and the Turlock Basin fit, since we are on different timeline.
Questions? Comments? Thank you. Public outreach update. Herb?
Good evening, Chair and Directors. I have a quick public outreach update, of which includes a video, so I will get right to it. Your Technical Advisory Committee has been busy working on some outreach items. A few of you that are associated with the Technical Advisory Committee have seen the video I'm about ready to show you already. My name's, before I forget, Herb Smart, member Technical Advisory Committee. And we're just going to jump into a 4.5 minute video that we produced that you are actually the first to see and will be unrolled to the public tomorrow through our social media channels, along with a website that I will also talk with you about in a second. So I'll just play the video now.
From 2012 to 2016, California experienced one of the worst droughts in its history. As reservoir levels dropped and rivers were reduced to mere trickles, many cities, farmers, and water districts pumped from underground water reserves. In the midst of that drought, California passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, in 2014. SGMA requires our region to develop, and implement detailed plans for how it will reach long-term groundwater sustainability. If you drink water, eat food, or grow crops, then this law matters to you. We all have a stake in this, and we all have a say in how this law is implemented locally. But first, let's get you familiar with groundwater. You live here, in what's called the San Joaquin Basin, one of the most agriculturally productive regions in the world. Within the San Joaquin Basin is a little subbasin we call the Turlock Subbasin, one of 515 basins and subbasins in the state. This subbasin covers 347,000 acres between the Tuolumne, Merced, and San Joaquin rivers. You can imagine the San Joaquin Basin as a giant bedrock tub filled with sediments and clay left over from an ancient sea that once covered the valley floor, on top of which lies gravel, soils, and silts washed down from the Sierra. Mixed within the soils, silts, clays, and gravel exists a massive store of fresh water. It took thousands of years for most of this water to get trapped among the layers of earth. As rains, rivers, and flood irrigation slowly seep through the porous soil and rock on the surface, water collects underground in what we call aquifers. We've been pumping this groundwater through wells for over a century. Currently, every city in our region relies almost exclusively on these aquifers for drinking water, while some farmers use it either exclusively or to supplement surface water from the rivers for irrigation. Compared to the rest of the state, Turlock Subbasin groundwater has been managed quite well. It's in better condition than other subbasins due to a reliable surface water supply from local rivers, reducing reliance on groundwater. Through SGMA, California became the last state in the West to regulate groundwater. SGMA empowered local agencies with greater authority to manage local groundwater. Local agencies will regulate and enforce usage as groundwater sustainability agencies, or GSAs. The GSA's job is to come up with groundwater sustainability plans, or GSPs. These GSPs will be our guiding documents for the next 2 decades. They'll define what groundwater sustainability actually means for the Turlock Subbasin, as well as outline what projects and programs we're going to need to implement. The goal is that the GSAs will create GSPs that will lead to groundwater sustainability by the year 2042. Fortunately, our region's leaders have been focused on managing surface water and groundwater in a connected, complementary manner long before SGMA required it. 100 years of sustainable farming practices and reliable surface water has put the Turlock Subbasin in a good position for SGMA's success. Since 1995, the Turlock Subbasin public agencies have been coordinating and communicating through formal and informal partnerships. So, while critically overdrafted subbasins were required to submit their sustainability plans by 2020, we have until 2022 thanks to the historical stewardship which has ensured that the Turlock Subbasin is not critically overdrafted. GSPs will be submitted to, reviewed, and approved by the Department of Water Resources. Once approved, they'll be enforced locally by the GSAs, who can regulate groundwater management and usage. But if GSAs fail to achieve sustainability, or if their plans are largely deficient, the State Water Resources Control Board can dictate groundwater management locally and implement its own requirements upon the Turlock Subbasin. Our subbasin is managed by 2 GSAs, a West Turlock GSA made up of these members, and an East Turlock GSA made up of these members. GSAs were formed through 2 years of collaborative discussions among local agencies. Together, we're making sure we achieve all groundwater sustainability goals within a unified GSP. Groundwater is critical to water management. SGMA and its associated regulations will shape our community for the next century. That's why we need the involvement of local stakeholders like you, because planning decisions are best made when they represent the community they affect. We've been charged with managing groundwater locally, and it's going to be one of the biggest water challenges of our generation.
So a couple points about the video. Make sure it doesn't start back up. Okay. First off, the timing of the release of the video is appropriate insofar as a week ago, other subbasins submitted, the 2020 subbasins submitted their GSPs to the state. So that's a piece of information that is top of mind for people, and we could compare ourselves to those in the fact that we have until 2022. Secondly, the video is about 4.5 minutes. We're working with the contractor that develop the video to develop minute-long vignettes, smaller pieces that we could also share on social media. And then lastly, this is obviously the English version. We're working to get it in a Spanish version, and we are also getting the files so that it can be website accessible with closed captioning as well. And so that is one piece that will be released tomorrow that you'll see on social media, and we'll provide the information through a lot of other sources as well. The second piece, you see it mentions turlockgroundwater.org, which is also turlockgroundwater.com. The Subbasin owns both domains. We have a new website that we're pointing them to, which is live right now, but will be announced tomorrow as well. And I'm not going to go through all the pages. It has a lot of the same information that was previously on the turlockgroundwater.org site, but it has some of the same messaging that we mentioned, that was mentioned in the video. Some things that we have right now, we have a page that says who we are and mentions the GSAs. What we are doing is devoted to GSP development and will be expanded as we start getting into more stakeholder involvement. Meetings and agendas, resources, and then a Get Involved tab, which goes to our stakeholder sign-up list. I've already, on this specific browser today, I've already been to the homepage, which is why you don't see the splash screen coming up that says sign up for our newsletter. But to every person who first visits the site, that will come up so that we can get emails, so that we can contact them. We have some 250, 275 emails already on our interested parties list, but we're always looking to grow that. So turlockgroundwater.org or .com, and although we're publishing it and marketing it as .org. So I encourage you to visit that in your spare time. Take a look at it. There's contact information on there as well. And one of the things that we have here is, and it was also in the back of the room and it was delivered to you at the dais, is we have a fact sheet which shares a lot of the same information that was mentioned in the video, a lot of the same branding, and it just discusses the subbasins, the GSP process, the Sigma compliance process, and this is a fact sheet that we could update as we move along in the process and keep some of the same branding. Those are 3 new things that will be unearthed tomorrow to the general public. So you're seeing them now tonight, all in the vein of education and outreach for our stakeholders, which hopefully, as we start having discussions, which Phyllis will talk about in a minute, what happens next with groundwater sustainability plan development in way of defining sustainability and all the things that follow that into what we hope will be robust stakeholder engagement. I'll note before I close that all of these projects were funded by round 2 grant funding that we received from the Department of Water Resources, which is why you see at the end of the video, at the bottom of our website, and at the bottom in smaller font on the fact sheets that these were funded by that. And we're working within the contract we have for that grant with DWR to make sure that we comply with the requirements to making sure that we reimburse it with those funds. So that is all I have for public outreach for this meeting. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have at this time.
Excellent video.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Budget update, Michael.
Good evening, directors. I have a couple of different, there's 2 main accounts. One is the West Turlock Subbasin GSA. It's for this board in particular. And then the other one, we take care of the basin-wide account. So it's commingled funds between the east and the west. And so this is all the activity for January of this year. Due to the holidays, things were kind of caught up or cached and posted and everything. So for the West Turlock, we had $243,141 as of January 31st. That's our bank statement. And then here's some of the activity for January. On to the basin-wide account, These are the invoices we paid Todd and that were cash. So the basin account has $638,812 as of January 31st. And then here's the activity for that. And so we will expect to kind of start, so for the grant, we will probably start cutting into the basin amount more because we've been being reimbursed by DWR, but now as those funds start running out, it's going to be our participation. So as we move forward. Any questions? Okay, thank you.
Michael? Admin update, Valerie.
Thank you, Valerie Kincaid, West Turlock GSA Council. Two updates. First, the Fair Political Practices Commission requires all public officials to file statements of financial interest. Many of you know those as Form 700s and are well acquainted with them. But for those who aren't, recall that the purpose of them is, one, to provide the public disclosure of public officials' financial interests, and the second is to remind public officials to avoid conflicts of interest decisions and participating in those. They are due April 1st. I believe, Faye, have we sent out a request for those? Okay, great. So Faye will send out a request for those. We do keep them in-house at the agency. They are public records, but we don't send them out or file them with the Secretary of State, but they are required by April 1. So remember to do that. And then second, just a quick update, both Lacey and Herb mentioned it, but the GSP submittals for the 2020 basins, the critically overdrafted basins, were due in the last day of January. Interestingly, by the skin of their teeth, in some basins, they got them in on time. So 46 GSPs were submitted to DWR. DWR has posted for public comment 24 of them. 22, they are still reviewing for completeness. There's at least a minimum 60-day public comment period. So DWR, the process is DWR receives them, make sure they're complete. There's not huge pieces missing. If they are complete, they post them within 20 days of receipt. There's a 60-day comment period. And then after that, DWR has 2 years to review. So half of those are up, and the public comment period is April 15th. So they're up, and they got in, and a lot of them, like I said, was right at the end. There was a lot of uploading, I think, and at 5 o'clock on the 31st, they were all posted. So a lot of lessons to be learned from that submittal, both on the technical side and the political side and the substantive side. And certainly looking at those as we develop our GSP is going to be something this basin would be smart to do and will do. So, any questions for me? Thank you.
Moving on to a solo agenda item, update on the Turlock Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Plan. Phyllis.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I'm Phyllis Stannon with Todd Groundwater, and I'm the technical lead for the team putting together the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. And I have a few slides to help me get organized here. And on this first slide, I'd just like to start by acknowledging my sub-consultants shown here, David's Engineering and Woodard & Curran. Both of their logos are there. They did much of the work that I'm going to be reviewing to you today. So just wanted to give a shout out to them as we begin to move forward. So for an update for this groundwater sustainability plan, I'll just start first with a schedule. So recall that we've got a 4-year process here, and we're just about halfway through that process. We hope to have a draft plan in about 18 months, so we're counting down. I think the last time that I was in front of you, I said that we were finishing up the groundwater model and we were developing the preliminary water budgets, and that would be back in front of you about late summer. Well, it's a little past late summer, and I'm here to say that there was a delay in our schedule, but we think that we managed it well. So when we rolled out our groundwater model in April of this year, of 2019, we saw that there were a lot of areas of the groundwater model that really weren't well calibrated. And we knew that we wanted to use this model for projected water budgets going forward as a planning tool. And we thought we really needed to spend a little bit more time getting a better handle on what was going on in those areas and trying best to understand what we've got. And as a result of that, we had a little bit of a schedule delay, and that's shown there for those two green bars. Those green bars are all the tasks or the components, so to speak, for the groundwater sustainability plan and for the development of the local model and then the application of that model to develop some water budgets. Those were the two tasks that we felt like we really had to spend a little bit more time on. They are completed now. We're wrapping those up. We presented the results at the joint TAC in December. It's a tremendous amount of information, and I won't belabor all of that tonight. I think we had 98 slides associated with that technical workshop with the joint tax, but I have 10 of them with me tonight, and I thought I would like to just run through those so that you get a better understanding of exactly what we've done so far from a technical basis and how that kind of sets us up to go forward on the sustainability plan. And so going into the model, recall that we're using that C2V SIM model. We've talked about this before. It's a DWR model that covers the entire Central Valley. It's used primarily by DWR as a planning tool, and it had some real advantages to bringing it into the groundwater sustainability plan. For one thing, it's an integrated surface water groundwater model. You probably remember from Herb's video just now that we're surrounded by river boundaries and that we're hydraulically connected with all of our adjacent subbasins. And as a result of that, we really needed a tool that recognized that interaction of the river system and the groundwater system. So having that integrated model code for that C2V SIM is a real advantage. Another advantage, of course, is that this is a DWR model. They're going to be grading our papers, so using a tool that they're very familiar with and that they support, we thought would be really advantageous for us. It's being used also in Merced, and we're using it in Modesto. And so how nice to be able to have, as a technical person, it's so wonderful to be able to have, if you have connected groundwater in the subsurface, you don't want to artificially cut it, just at a river, especially at a river where there's a lot of interaction. So by doing it from the Merced all the way to the Modesto subbasin, we've got a good opportunity for all of us to be coming up, all the technical people would be coming up with the same answers with respect to the groundwater interaction along the river boundaries. And so that was really advantageous for us. Again, DWR is going to be using this tool, so we thought how best to use it here for us. And then finally, and this is not a small point, the GSP regulations actually anticipate that you will consider using this tool if you're in the Central Valley. You don't have to use their tool. You can use another model if you'd like. If you do, you're required to provide more information and documentation that it really is a good tool. So for all of these reasons and a few more, we pulled this tool into our groundwater sustainability plan, but we couldn't use it unmodified. There were so many things associated with a DWR planning tool that is broad brush. It's too generalized. It didn't have the real specificity that we needed for our water budget data. And as a result of that, we spent quite a bit of time compiling, bugging all of your staff for all of your detailed information to be able to pull together monthly data for the water budgets over a 25-year period from 1991 to 2015, and then put that into the C2V SIM model so that we had real Turlock Subbasin data within the model. This is just an example of some of the land use and surface water use that we pulled together to bring in. There's a variety of water budget components that we pulled in. And then when we couldn't calibrate in some areas, we actually looked at the data to see if we couldn't make more detailed local estimates. And I think we did a good job. And so the good news is that we now have a calibrated tool, and we feel pretty comfortable with it. We completed it, as I mentioned before, in the April-May time period for 2019, recognized we needed to do some more work on that, and presented the calibrated model to the joint tax in December. There are two ways to kind of gauge or grade whether or not a groundwater surface water model is behaving properly or giving you what you need to make sure that you can accurately simulate what you need to know. One is looking at the calibration statistics, and that's just a little scatter plot example of some of the statistics that this model has sort of rigorously gone through to make sure that we can test it and that we feel like it's reliable data. What that's plotting is water levels that the model simulates versus water levels that we've actually measured and observed in wells. So if the model were 100% perfect, everything would fall along a straight line, and it's not uncommon for a model to be imperfect. And as a result, we always take a look at these scatter plots. And other than a few details here and there, I think you'll agree that generally speaking, it looks like it aligns pretty well with that straight line. In addition to sort of this overall model statistics that we look at, we also try to look in certain areas and make sure that the water levels are matching what we've measured. And so I'm going to go through just 3 quick areas with you on how we view that. These are hydrographs that you're going to be seeing. The blue lines are from the model. The black dots are actually measured values at that space that the model gave us that blue line. And the location map is located in that northeastern portion in the upper right area of the slide. And you can see that there's a blue dot and a purple dot, and there's going to be 3 slides, and they're all going to be looking like this, where you have the left side is the blue dot, and the right side is the purple dot. And if that makes sense, what I'm trying to show here is that the dots are close to the blue lines. This is in the western portion. This was one of the areas that we had a little trouble with, and this is because it's a confined aquifer below the Corcoran clay. And in this area, a confined aquifer responds so quickly to pumping, and so you'll see those black dots kind of jumping around a little bit more than the blue line can keep up with, meaning that the black dots are probably near a pumping location, and so the model is trying to keep up with that. But for the most part, you can tell, I think you'll see that you can see the scale there is only 10 feet off. And so, you know, we're doing a pretty good job. At least the model is simulating close to what we've measured. And then we get even better as we go away from the confined aquifer. And I'm moving now to sort of the north central portion where you can see 2 additional hydrographs there. And the important thing that we always look for is not so much that the black dot lands right on that blue line, but that the trends and the fluctuations over that 25-year period are generally represented. And the model really is reading those trends and fluctuations across that 25-year period pretty well. If you're used to looking at model plots and you're a hydrogeologist and you see this, you're going, that's great, especially on the right there where we catch that recent decline in the drought. And then finally, moving to the central portion of the subbasin where we had even more water level declines, the model is doing a really good job there. And that's important to us because that's going to be an area where we're going to be looking very closely at the water budget. So that's just an example of all of the hydrographs that we've looked at. And then not only do the hydrographs at locations work well now, but also when we pull all of it together and we do water level contours based on what the model simulates, it's looking really well with respect to what we have contoured ourselves from the observed data. And in specifically, I've just given you one example here. This happens to be spring 2015. It has some significance with respect to sigma because it's sort of a sigma baseline. The question that we'll be asking ourselves is, did we have undesirable results as of January 1, 2015? That's sort of the process that you begin to think about whether or not you're already sustainable, and you can begin to use spring 2015 data to try to begin to answer these questions. In general, again, this is just one contour map for one time period, a snapshot time period, but in general, we see high water levels in the west, lower water levels in the east, and sort of water moving from the areas of high water levels to low water levels throughout the basin, which is obviously to be expected. But again, the point here is that the model is simulating really reasonable looking water level contour maps that match what we have for measured data. So we feel like we've got an excellent tool to sort of look at the water budgets now historically, look at them projected going forward, and begin to really have sort of those targets for if we have overdraft conditions, how much and where, and how do we sort of move in the direction of managing that. This is a water budget diagram, and it just gives you some kind of an idea about the complexity of what we're doing with the model. We're looking at streams, which are shown there on the left in blue, the root zone beneath the irrigated agricultural areas, and also the root zone of lawns and other urbanized areas where you have outdoor landscaping and return flows. And then you can see on the side of the graph, we also have a model that's capable of looking at the interconnection with our neighboring subbasins. So we see inflow and outflow from a subsurface basis shown by those yellow arrows. And then the interaction between those two components and groundwater. So the model, and that was a really nice advantage of having this model, is that it really is integrated. And this is the idea that the model is capable of simulating the streams, simulating the root zone, simulating the unsaturated zone, simulating groundwater, and then how the water moves in and among all of those three positions. And I won't go through the numbers on this graph, but if you looked at all the inflows and outflows for the groundwater system, which is that orange box on the bottom, you come up with something like this over time. So this is the historical water budget. Again, it's a 25-year period, 1991 to 2015. It shows inflows above the zero line and outflows below the zero line on an annual basis for each one of those 25-year periods. And what we're looking for really is this orange that says change in groundwater and storage. And it's a little, this is an interesting chart, so just give me a second to talk about the orange here, because that's what we're trying to focus on. So what happens is, let's just take this time period of 1998, when we had a whole lot of inflows here and not so much outflows. So we say, what is the change in groundwater and storage needed to balance those two? In other words, if we have more inflows than outflows, then we have increased the groundwater and storage. If we have more, I'm sorry, did I say that wrong? If we have more outflows than inflows, we decrease groundwater storage. If we have more inflows, then we increase groundwater and storage. So it's kind of funny the way that this chart shows things, because people tend to think about anything that's below this zero line as a negative, but with respect to how the groundwater and storage balances this chart, these are the wet years. The time period that you're actually gaining groundwater and storage is down here. And the time that we're losing groundwater out of storage is up here. And that's what you can see during the drought of record, which we have these last few years. We have all of this increasing orange, meaning we've lost some groundwater out of storage during that time period because we needed the water. So over time, if you added up all of those orange boxes that you see on here, and then you divide it by 21, you get an average annual deficit of about 58,000 acre-feet a year. And just to give you some kind of an indication, because there's a lot of water moving around this basin, a lot of water moving in, a lot of water moving out, that 58,000 acre-feet a year is somewhere around, depending on the year, 10 to 15% of the pumping in the subbasin. So we're going to need to think about how we can manage the subbasin to be able to make up that level of deficit, something like 10 to 15% of our pumping. So that gets us into a position where we can begin thinking about what sustainable management criteria look like. And we've already started talking about that at the TAC level. We're going to continue to do that at the February TAC meeting. And we're doing that at the same time that the modeling team is moving forward. And so let's talk a little bit about next steps. We're going to be revising some of these water budget numbers because we are working also to get the model up to speed in the Modesto subbasin. They're a little bit behind the Turlock subbasin right now. And as soon as we can get all of their numbers revised in the model, we'll have a better understanding of what the flows are going on, both recharge in the Tuolumne River, groundwater feeding back into the Tuolumne, and the subsurface flows going between Modesto and Turlock beneath the river. So those are the details that we're putting together right now. The modeling team is also putting together some baseline conditions. So we have some targets now from a historical water budget perspective, but really we need to think about the future going forward. And SGMA actually requires that you take 50 years of hydrology and project that into the future. So we have 20 years to be sustainable, but our simulations need to go out for 70 years so that we have some kind of an understanding about what the future might bring. And the future has to look at various things that DWR has provided for us, including climate change impacts. Those are simply factors that we look at with respect to a possible hotter and drier climate. And then we put together land use changes, population projection. A lot of this comes out of the urban water management plans and the agricultural water management plans that we have in the subbasin to be able to put this together. And we'll be working on these baseline conditions with the joint tax that will help guide that process. Lacey had mentioned that we're going to begin publication of the GSP chapters on the website. The joint tax are going to give us feedback on that, and then when we get that, we'll be ready to put those up. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to really start to begin that discussion of sustainable management criteria, in particular in February, asking, of course, those big questions in SGMA of what are our undesirable results. The subbasin defines those for the subbasin. So we have some of the 2020 plans around us. We know how they've done it. We can consider that and move forward with something that we think is right for this subbasin. And then also what criteria are needed for the sustainable management. And it's never too early to start talking about projects. So Lacey mentioned that one of the tools that's coming out of the Prop 68 grant that the subbasin received will be a detailed recharge assessment, even on a parcel level basis, field level basis. So we're going to be able to pull together a lot more detailed information to begin to have a screening tool for projects and management actions going forward. So that's what we're up to. We're very busy, but at least we have a good tool. I feel like we're in good shape with respect to the model to help us figure out what we're doing going forward. So that's really it for me, and happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Can we get this slide deck?
The last workshop, there was some more information on the west and the Turlock subbasins, split out. Can you give us some highlights on that over that same 21-year time frame for our west Turlock?
Sure, of course. So of the 58,000 that we have, about 40,000 of that is actually the West Turlock. And that seems surprising, I think, because when you look at the water level contours, you go, well, wait a minute, that was where the water levels were higher, so how could that be? And the answer is because if you look at I'm going to see if I can pull up a map. This will help here. So do you see how the West Turlock subbasin it actually includes Turlock Lake and some of this area to the north here. And so when you start to see what the water budget is doing on a subbasin basis, let's just think about how this would work. So we have inflows from Modesto into this little area, and then we immediately have outflows. And so this outflow all around this area right here is assigned to the West Turlock subbasin. So do you see how you would think 40,000 acre feet of the 58,000 acre feet? Does that make sense with respect to the West Turlock subbasin? And a lot of that is just because of the way that you have the GSA boundaries drawn. But in general, we have water levels moving to the northeast, to the east, to the south, into the Merced subbasin. This is kind of an interesting little thing here. It kind of moves right around and then kind of comes right back in.
We had a net inflow from the Merced subbasin.
We have a net inflow from the Merced Subbasin,
That's flowing into the east.
correct. But in the west side, we actually are losing water out. So because the water levels are higher in the west, water levels are moving into the San Joaquin River. They're moving north out of the subbasin, and they're moving northeast and east into the areas where water levels are lower. So in some ways, it's a little bit misleading with respect to exactly what the two water budget results are from one GSA to another. And it's just because everything is just so darn interconnected.
Questions for Phyllis?
Are these numbers calculated every year?
Yes. 1991 through 2015.
Oh, so 17, 18, 19 are not calculated?
No, not yet, and here's why. When we got the C2V SIM model, it was calibrated through 2015, and it was going to be a heavy lift to do anything to update it. And so we took the format of the model that we had to move forward quickly with that and revise that for the historical period. So we have average annual conditions, but we don't have the most recent data in the model. We do have the most recent data, and we can come up with water budget numbers for that. But right now we've been focused on our time period that the model covers, because we want to use that model as a planning tool. And if you're going to use it as a planning tool, you have to make sure that it's well calibrated and that it matches the historical data. So that's really been where our focus is. But that doesn't mean we're going to ignore what's happening now. This is a good question. Thank you.
Anything else for
Okay.
Phyllis? Thanks for the update.
Thanks very much.
Any other comments on the board? Seeing none, 6:51, I'll call the meeting adjourned. Thank you. Next scheduled meeting, May 7th, 6 PM, unless something special pops up.